So I'm sure at least some of you out there will have had miniatures that you've not been able to pick up in 10th edition due to Games Workshop having really low stock levels. Let's talk about a few examples, and the weirdness of having a game where some of the pieces might be very hard to find. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it could be interesting to take a look at a few of the most cited examples of things of Games Workshops that have gone out of stock recently and perhaps just been excessively hard to find for certain people's factions. This isn't exactly a massively new thing with Warhammer 40K and Games Workshop in general, but I feel like perhaps over the past year or so, as well as things just selling out very quickly when Games Workshop released them, quite a lot of things that you might more consider part of Games Workshop's more core range, things that they've had as products for a while, or gone on full release and then basically been part of their core range. There's clearly been things that have been in very limited supply, and people want far more of them than Games Workshop seems to have produced. I must admit it's a pretty weird idea when Games Workshop has armies that a genuine barrier to entry might be their own levels of stock of the miniatures within that army, varying a bit over time of course, and somewhat dependent on where you live around the world, but perhaps a bit weird when Games Workshop might have sold you on a miniature between its looks, lore and rules, but then if you actually go to them, then you get that little temporarily out of stock thing, and have the option to sign up for email reminders or placing an order not knowing when it would eventually be shipped from things like local gaming stores. Shortages and supply chain issues maybe aren't the most uncommon thing ever since the pandemic. To my understanding, Games Workshop usually makes miniatures depending on their production capacity, something that's fairly rigid and would need to have big investment and a lot more resources to expand, and if they're making Warhammer to all the capacity that they can produce, making copies of any one certain kit actually does impact the production of how many they might produce of other things due to how many molds they can have running at the same time. Over the past year or so, it's been at least heavily speculated that a lot of Games Workshop stock issues have been due to the Leviathan box and its launch for 10th edition 40k. Games Workshop perhaps not wanting to repeat the fiasco that was Indomitus, where they hyped up that box set for ages and then it basically sold out within a few minutes of it going online, meaning that they had to do another big production run for it, and perhaps leaving a fair bit of money on the table for people who might have wanted to buy it but then weren't able to pick it up. That combined with the fact that the Warhammer range is really quite big and is basically ever expanding, with new miniature releases just about every month. Some things certainly do go out of production from time to time, but in general the new kits seem to outweigh that, I'd say. And the sheer amount of products that Games Workshop have must be a bit of a logistical nightmare, with thousands of items to try and keep in stock as much as they can, and also in different locations around the world as well. Then perhaps the bit that I was most interested in for this video is the idea that rules do generally seem to drive a fair few sales for people playing with miniatures for the game. In particular, I think 10th edition would have really exacerbated that, as basically they've taken every single datasheet in Warhammer 40k, given it new rules, so maybe for some armies, certain units are just massively at the forefront of the units that you want to run in your army, whereas a few others might have been a bit more marginalised or sidelined and not treated very kindly by their rules. It's going to mean that some miniatures just have loads of demands placed upon them at very short notice, things that Games Workshop probably didn't anticipate. So suddenly a miniature that's been kind of sidelined for a while might suddenly have loads of demand and lots of people wanting to pick it up, and that leads to sellouts quite quickly sometimes. For this video I thought it could be interesting just to talk through a few examples that people certainly seem to have struggled to get hold of over the last few months or so, and talk through a few of the potential impacts. First up, I feel like the Gladiator Lancer was definitely a good example of this from the start of 10th edition. The Gladiator tanks in 9th edition were kind of usable but not really that exciting. And then going on to 10th edition, in particular the Lancer went from a very big unreliable one-shot gun platform to one that's got loads of built-in rerolls and is just massively threatening. Pretty much some of the best long-range anti-tank that the Space Marines got. This seems to have led the Gladiator kits to have been sold out really quite a lot around the world. I feel like it was quite a common discussion in comment sections saying that yes, I would add a Gladiator Lancer to the list if I could find any of them, but given that they seem to be about as rare as hen's teeth out there, I'll probably be going with the Leviathan Ballistus Dreadnought or the Repulsor Executioner or something. At time of recording it looks like it's now currently back in stock in the UK, though out of stock in the USA and Australia. Some things do seem to be better or worse in different regions of the world. The UK definitely seems to have more frequent restocks and more things that tend to be in stock than around the world, though it does vary on any one thing. Nurglings also seem to be a particularly good example of this as well. These guys seem to have been in a bit of a perfect storm, being a unit that almost every Chaos list, beyond Thousand Suns and World Eaters, might generally be helped out by a unit or two of them. These little guys are just ridiculously cheap units to put on the board at 35 points for a unit that's actually surprisingly tanky given the amount of wounds that they have for the cost, and then both having the infiltrate and deep strike keywords built in, meaning they're pretty much god tier for screening and doing secondary objectives. Again, I feel like these guys have been really quite commonly proxied for tournaments and things. They're currently out of stock in the UK, Australia and America. I've seen a few conversions going on with things like single Nurglings on top of a pile of other bits, or using other things like swarms from the Galapox infected to stand in a little bit. I have a bit of a suspicion that Games Workshop might want to try and make them less ubiquitously good when we have the January balanced data slate. I guess we'll wait and see then though. Chaos Knight War Dogs seem to have been the kit that Chaos Knight players have been struggling to get a hold of with any reliability all the way back since when their codex first came out back in 2022. Chaos Knights aren't exactly a big faction, with only 2 real dedicated model kits for them, plus using some things from the Imperial Knight range. The Chaos Knight War Dogs were the new ones they introduced for the 2022 codex. And it does seem that basically ever since that kit came out, Games Workshop seems to have kind of pushed Chaos Knight armies into War Dog spam over using the big Titanic Knights. Both in 9th edition and now 10th edition, by far the most common thing run in tournaments tends to be just hordes of the little guys. Carnivores and brigands and stalkers and the like. Perhaps due to that, despite them being a relatively recent kit release, Games Workshop really seems to have not kept them in stock very well. It seems that the usual pattern of them is that they come back in stock for a bit, then really quite suddenly sell out, just yo-yoing between one and the other. Though it often means that if you do place orders at third-party retailers and things, often the order might get met, but it might take a few months to do so. Again, it seems like they've maybe been a bit more back frequently in the UK in stock compared with elsewhere in the world like the USA. Currently it looks like they're in stock in the USA, but out of stock in the USA and Australia. Perhaps a bit annoying seeing as it's basically the kit that basically almost every Chaos Knight player is going to want in abundance. The smaller knights on the fighting line that you need for objectives and things, ideally around the bigger knights, that often just run en masse in competitive lists. Next up we've got the Leagues of Votann Sagittor. A few of the Votann kits have been a bit more in or out of stock, though I feel like the Sagittor has been the one that I've heard talked about the most that people have been struggling to get a hold of. And again, this seems to have been in 9th edition as well as in 10th edition. Though in 10th edition I feel like it probably added fuel to the fire of these being out of stock more often, given that these little moonbuggy type transports could be arguably one of the single most competitive units for the faction right now. I've seen some similar sort of complaints about the Einherjar Hearthguard, but it does look like these kits currently are in stock in the UK, USA and Australia, at least at time of recording this video. Otherwise, for similar recent releases, the World Eaters 8-bound have been a good example as well. When the World Eaters Codex dropped in early 2023, there were some pretty cool big ticket items, the new Berserkers, Angron, and their new Jackals box set. I feel like the 8-bound maybe had the most pressure placed upon them, as they're going to be a miniature set that lots of people want several copies of, given that they're the only unique elite infantry they've got right now. At least more unique than the standard rank and file Khorne Berserkers they have. Competitive lists in 9th edition went really heavy on them, and the same is true for 10th edition now that their points went down a bit, often making up a brutal core of the army alongside Angron and some supporting Berserkers and things. It was perhaps so much so that one of the main reactions that the World Eaters Christmas box set got with Angron, 2 sets of these and some Khorne Berserkers, was that yes, this is finally a kit where we can get some 8-bound from. Though it does seem that Games Workshop might be steadying the ship a bit more. Again, it looks like they're back in stock in at least a few different places around the world at time of recording. Next up, for a more recent example, the Canoptek Wraiths are a kit that's gone straight out of stock as soon as the Necron Codex came out. These ones definitely feel like an example where game rules have absolutely caused the kit to sell out very quickly. In 9th edition, they were usable, but I wouldn't say particularly exciting for most of it. In general, a lot of Necron players might not actually have too many of these if they started in 9th edition, and then went on to 10th edition, where perhaps if you wanted a slightly more optimal Necron list, you'd often be building around big supported blocks of Warriors or Lich Guard. Now though, they've basically become one of the new Necron meta units, pretty much the most efficient frontline brawlers, and doing better for the role than Warriors or Lich Guard do currently. What with being fairly fast, really quite big tough stat lines with 4 wounds, and access to the Feel No Pain from the Technomancer. Again, these guys do seem to be pretty comprehensively out of stock right now, currently out of stock in the UK, USA and Australia. Definitely a big spike of short-term demand there. I was kind of interested to see what sort of things these shortages were doing to second-hand market things. If there's basically no supply of a thing and only a few people are selling it, usually means that prices go pretty high, I guess you could either see it as scalping things a bit, or just genuinely the fact that not many people want to sell, that when there's a supply and demand mismatch, things can go a bit crazy. Looking at a few completed eBay auctions, it does look like the Canoptek Wraiths are going for significantly more than Games Workshop would sell them for right now. One box out of this set looked like it went for well over £100, which is kind of mad if that is indeed accurate. But it seems that a lot of them have been going for a good 50% more than their asking price around the world. Perhaps for another example of a meta unit, the Eldari Fire Prism and Night Spinner has been reported to be in some slightly lower stock levels around the world. Again, this one is in stock in the UK but out in the USA and Australia. I guess this one's perhaps had a bit of a double whammy of people wanting to pick it up, due to Fire Prisms just having some kind of broken anti-tank damage at 10th edition's launch, and while the Night Spinner was great before, it's now maybe one of the standout best units in the Eldari Codex, even more so, with a little bit of precision devastating wounds that it can throw out, plus the ability to stop units moving around anywhere near as easily. Given that Eldar are pretty much the top tournament faction these days, maybe not too surprising that these things have been in demand. For the Tyranids, I feel like I've certainly heard a fair bit of anecdotal discussion that quite a lot of the Tyranid range just hasn't been in good stock since the 10th edition launch boxes came out. I guess that might stand to reason a little bit, given that loads of people might have been jumping into the faction, given that they're one of the primary factions of 10th edition. After you've picked up Leviathan boxes, you might be tempted to get other things within the range. Maybe the Maleceptor is quite a good example of that. A really quite strong Tyranid monster to have on the front line when it's very tough with its invulnerable save and has some good psychic shooting. These things have been strong for the Tyranids since they came out at the start of 10th, and they've got a slight reversal of the usual geography, it would seem, out of stock in the UK and USA, but in stock in Australia. Overall, I feel like it's never really going to be a good news story when people want to go to Games Workshop to pick up some shiny plastic models, and it turns out there's not enough of them to go around. It does seem that out of the geography, the UK does seem to do the best for more frequent restocks, though occasionally things do tend to sell out locally. For more competitive play armies, I feel like it might deepen the gap a bit between theorycraft lists that you might want to build versus what you actually have and what you can paint up. I feel like for the majority of 40k collectors out there, which maybe collect things with a nod to what's good in-game, they'd probably be a bit more tempted to add some of these meta units to their lists, but maybe not be so bothered about it that they'd actually go and seek out, say, things that are being resold at higher prices on eBay, or be super engaged enough to be constantly checking the web store to see when the kits are back in stock, or be on hair trigger alerts to follow other channels that are looking out for that. That could perhaps be one of the reasons that meta chasing could be a bit more expensive than some things if you're going for all the kits that everyone else is trying to buy, unless you get lucky and manage to land some from the source, or can do something like proxy, convert, or 3D print an alternative. Buying marked up versions of these could be very expensive if you absolutely have to have the official plastic kit. I've definitely seen a few people discussing the possibility of using 3D printing or recast for when Games Workshop isn't managing to sell a certain product. I guess that's not something that Games Workshop really want going on too much, but I feel like in people's minds it often does lessen the barrier to feeling guilty about doing so. If GW seems not to be able to be selling the official model, even if you're fully prepared to pay for the full fat plastic version, it does seem likely that at least a few more people might go elsewhere if Games Workshop's not delivering the goods. At the moment it does look like at least a few of these do still seem to have issues around the world, perhaps the USA and Australia more so than the UK right now. Fingers crossed this might get a little bit better as 10th edition rolls out. I guess in theory Games Workshop shouldn't be putting all their effort into building Leviathan boxes for the game anymore, so maybe they've got a bit more time to catch up on production for a few other things. Let me know if the model shortages have ever been impacting you at all with collecting your armies so far in 10th edition. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that down in the comments below. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.